warm welcome to all of our viewers and thank you for tuning in to the European Union side events at COP26. Ever since the EU introduced the European New Deal in 2019, it has set out a comprehensive vision for sustainable finance through the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. Since then, the EU has made new tools available, such as the EU Taxonomy, to drive transparency among EU companies and to form the basis of investment opportunities for both EU residents and global investors. Following on from this, the subject of our panel discussion today is the challenges and opportunities of putting sustainable finance into practice. While we have organized a few other sessions this week, which examine the EU's range of regulatory tools, this panel will focus specifically on the ground level practicalities of actually using these tools to support the financing of sustainable activities. We've tried to make this session as interactive as possible. Shortly, I will carry out 3 audience polls before I bring out our panelists. You'll also be able to ask our panelists questions via the Slido platform. We have allocated roughly 10 minutes at the end of the slot to answer audience questions, so do take this chance to clear up any lingering questions you might have. Now I would like to invite Ula Hudina, Deputy Head of Unit Access to Finance at the Directorate General, Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship, and SMEs within the European Commission to deliver her welcoming remarks. Over to you, Ula.
Thank you, Khalid. Let me start by saying that Europe is ambitious. And this was also highlighted prominently by the Commission President von der Leyen at the start of the COP26, as well as some other Commission representatives in the last couple of days. With the European Green Deal presented already in autumn 2019, immediately after the start of the von der Leyen Commission, we at the Commission set very ambitious goal to become the first CO2 emission neutral continent by 2050. And as a milestone to reach and meet this objective, in this July, we adopted the Fit for 55 package, which aims to make the EU's climate, energy, transport, and also taxation policies fit for reducing the set target of -55, at least -55 by 2030 compared to the EU levels at 1999. And all this ambitious, as stressed, they require tremendous overhaul, no doubt, of the EU legislation and also the industry, just to name a few, the production processes, transport, sourcing, etc. And all this will require, and that's topic of the day, huge investments. We estimate that some 350 billion euros will be needed per year just to meet the set energy targets. In addition, we estimate that some 130 billion euros will be needed to meet the other environmental goals. So there are huge investment needs. And in order to meet them, or in order to enable them, at the Commission, we are putting into practice and in place a sustainable finance framework. The first one was as part of the EU Green Deal, was the so-called Sustainable Europe Investment Plan, which is our ambition to mobilize at least 1 trillion euros in sustainable investments in the next decade. And the second, even more importantly, is that we are putting in place the new sustainable finance strategy, the one presented in this July. And this is the vision for mobilizing sustainable finance in the coming years, and basically to bring in private investments in addition to huge amounts of the EU money and public money already directed to the sustainable finance. And in order to support and achieve all these Green Deal objectives, as just explained, of course, the focus needs to be on leveraging private investments as the public cannot fit in and cannot meet all the demands. And at the Commission, we are also offering some instruments. And in other words, these are our opportunities that we are offering. Of course, taxonomy, the most important one here, and not to prejudge our discussion later on in this panel. And also lots has been said already on taxonomy in the last couple of days at COP26. But overall, the taxonomy is basically a classification system for sustainable investments. creating clarity and transparency. And these should be the basic rules. And then we are offering a voluntary, still voluntary, European green bond standards. Most importantly, we are offering lots of financial tools, financial instruments, EU funds combined with public member states' money, and as stressed before, by leveraging in private investments. And very important, this notion is with the so-called Next Generation EU, which coupled with the current MFF, EU's budget until 2027, there is a condition that at least 30% of all these EU funds goes into climate transition, into green transition. All the investments that are needed, 30% needs to go from Next Generation EU and MFF into this objective. Quite substantial amounts, the biggest amounts ever. And part of the Next Generation EU is also the InvestEU program, which is a continuation of the successful COSME program, which was focused on the SMEs. And the InvestEU, as we have it now, it has 4 windows, one of them being also the sustainable infrastructure, and the other one being the SME window. And let me stress here that especially with the InvestEU and the SME window, we are working with partners towards a very pragmatic approach for SMEs, not to overburden them, and to have the so-called sustainability proofing that would make the life of SMEs easier. And then there are other tools, other financial tools, especially the Innovation Fund. There is the so-called European Innovation Council with its fund as part of the Horizon Europe. And let me also stress that especially with the focus on the SMEs, which are definitely the backbone of the European economy, without them, such green transition cannot happen, that we will be offering much more advisory services to them as of next year, especially in the context of the EEN, that's the Enterprise Europe Network. So basically, these were the tools. And as I said, these are the opportunities that we are trying to offer. And I'm looking forward, and back to you, Khalid, to our discussion later on.
Many thanks, Ula. Given that today's session will focus on the practicalities of sustainable investing, I'm delighted to be joined by 3 speakers who are themselves experienced practitioners in the field. I will introduce them in the order in which they will deliver their opening remarks. First, let's welcome Francesco Bicciato, Secretary General of the Italian Sustainable Investment Forum, ITASIF, Faith Ward, who is the chair of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, the IGCC, and also the Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Brunel Pension Partnership, a local authority pension fund here in the UK. And last but not least, we have Marilyn Horatz, Strategy and Business Development Officer at the European Investment Fund. Now that you are acquainted with our speakers, we would like to take this opportunity to get to know your views and areas of focus within sustainable finance. We've prepared 3 poll questions, which will hopefully help us do just that. Don't worry, they won't be very hard. You should be able to respond to these questions via the tools on the Slido platform. And hopefully we will have the questions also flashed on screen as well. There we go. Fantastic. All right, let's start with the first question. Are you following the developments on the EU taxonomy in order to analyze its impact on your business? Yes or no? I'll give you maybe just a few seconds to click yes or no. Well, that's a promising start. I'll take that as the final answer then. We've got all of our audience members have been tracking the EU taxonomy. You're lucky that we won't be testing those claims, but we will take it in good faith. Right, the second question is, hopefully our IT team would, yes. Are you aware of the EU funding tools to support the real sector's green transition? Oh, no, we have some dissenters here. Oh, that's gone all the way down to 10%, 9%. Can we go down even further? No, I think that's a good balance. Oh, we've gone up 17%. Are we closing the polls? I think we'll close the polls. I think that's a good start. 83% isn't bad. That's more than a passing grade. And for the 17%, hopefully this session will hopefully fill in some of those gaps in your understanding. We all like a good challenge. And finally, our final question for this session: are you aware of support, either financial or advisory, available at national level to support the green transition? It's a bit of a tough one, but it seems our audience has surpassed all expectations. We're now at 90%, 83% now, 17%. Oh, this is quite suspenseful. Oh, going even further down. Right. So we have 88% who are not aware, and 16% who are. Perfect. Well, I think we've found the ideal audience, some basic understanding of the context, and hopefully this session will be able to help fill in some of those gaps and hopefully make everyone a bit more excited about the sustainable finance agenda. Thank you very much for your participation. As a reminder, towards the end of our session, we will be able to take questions from the audience. So while you're listening to us, do feel free to add your questions via Slido. You just have to click on the Slido icon under information. So there's a tab marked information. Thank you very much for your participation. Now I'd like to invite Francesco from ETASIF to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you, Khalid. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon to all of the participants. I'm Francesco Bicciato, Secretary General of Forum for Sustainable Finance. Forum is the older organization in Italy specialized in sustainable finance. Born in 2001, we said we are celebrating the 20 years of sustainable finance in Italy. And ETASIF grew in terms of members and in terms of advocacy activities in Italy, but also in Europe, also through our membership in EuroSIF. EuroSIF is the European Organization of the Forum of Sustainable Finance. We are a multi-stakeholder organization, and we are composed by banks, asset manager, banking foundation, pension fund, insurance company, but also civil society organization like NGO, trade union. This is quite important because this kind of structure allows us to face the sustainable finance from different point of view, from different practitioner point of view. So I think that is quite important for us. Okay, today we will provide an overview of the general policy framework supporting a new paradigm based on sustainable and inclusive growth, focusing on objective and timeline of the implementation of the main regulatory measures that are put in place. We give an overview on how EU taxonomy can guide the companies in adopting transition plans, as well as provide investors with a science-based framework to assess and finance those plans and public institutions to define and improve their ecological transition policies. Finally, we would like to stress the issues of the challenges and the opportunities for sustainable finance, trying to understand which will be the scenario that we are in front of us, even after COP26. And this is related to two issues. The first one is the EU platform on sustainable finance. So how is this process of reform of sustainable finance is impacting on practitioners in their work of every day, and the draft reports on social economy, which for us is quite important, also with the extended framework for sustainable taxonomy. So we will try to give a look to this kind of issues, and we try to analyze this from the point of view of the practitioner, whom we are working every day. So for the moment, it's okay.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for those remarks. Next, we have Faith Ward, who will be representing the IIGCC. Over to you, Faith.
Exactly, and I can join Francesco in sort of celebrating 20 years as well. The IGCC is 20 years old this year, and in celebrating that. And over that time, we've seen this huge acceleration in the investment sector and the response from those investors to the climate emergency, I think, and the focus of that on the COP26 agenda, I think, is really showing through. So I'm here as chair of IIGCC, which represents over 39 trillion of assets in European-based investors who are focused on that mission to make serious progress to that decarbonisation, that net zero objective by 2030, to make that real world progress. And as part of that, what we've been doing over the last 2 years is the Paris Aligned Investor Initiative, and that has seen over 50 asset owners representing 2.8 trillion, with 200 asset managers representing 57 trillion. I keep having to check my numbers because they change every day. That's over half of global GDP now committed to net zero and making those commitments and making sort of tangible action towards these objectives. To help them along their way and to help them sort of what does this mean in practice, we developed something called the Net Zero Investor Framework. And this framework is a sort of a practical toolkit to actually really put these things into action. It has 2 key components. It has that focus on the decarbonisation, that need to reduce our sort of emissions intensity, the sort of near-term goals for that being around 50% emissions reduction by 2030, but by setting some near-term goals around that. But the other key component, one that perhaps we're elevating and particularly highlighting today, is that climate solutions and the needs to really invest in solving the problem. And as Ula says, really that opportunity set is massive. It's the need is enormous. I mean, just in the energy sector alone, we need 9.6% per annum invested in this space. It's creating a huge opportunity. We were delighted this week that through the Paris Aligned Investor Initiative to announce that over 130 billion have been committed over the next 10 years by Nordic and UK investors to really put that money to work to actually deliver those solutions. And the tools that we're talking about today will all help equip investors to bring those commitments to life.
Thank you, Faith. And finally, we have Marilyn from the European Investment Fund. Over to you, Marilyn.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I have some network issues here as I'm actually joining you from Glasgow of today's discussions. EIF, the European Investment Fund, for the ones you don't know, we are a specialist provider of risk finance in the EU. We develop and offer targeted financial products to our financial intermediary clients, such as banks, guarantee institutions, and fund managers. And by doing so, we enhance the SMEs and medium-sized companies access to affordable finance. We're part of the European Investment Bank Group, and our shareholders also include the European Union, represented by the Commission, but also a wide range of public and private financial institutions. Now, to tackle the challenges and opportunities around sustainable finance and to define actually what we mean with sustainability, we adopted last year, together with the EIB, a climate bank roadmap. Now, this might sound to some of you as another buzzword, but I can assure you it's far from that. We have set ourselves quite ambitious targets to mobilize and support 1 trillion of finance and sustainable real economy investments. But we've also adopted the Paris Alignment Framework that we are implementing across all our financial products, and not only the ones that will be targeting green investments. And we are already integrating also the EU Taxonomy definitions into our operations. All of this, we believe, will strengthen the EIB's group role as the EU Climate Bank and support the European Green Deal. EIF has a long track record in partnering with the European Commission and implementing the EU policy goals, such as supporting growth and innovation. We have been a key partner in rolling out instruments such as the Innofin SME guarantee, for example. And yeah, we are now also together with the Commission developing a new set of package of EU sustainable instruments, as already mentioned by Ulla. And I hope I can get back to you on that a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you all. Now that we've gotten introductions out of the way, let's turn our attention to the topic at hand, which is the challenges and opportunities of putting sustainable finance into practice. I'd like to kick off the discussion with Francesco, if you don't mind. Francesco, could you please spell out how the taxonomy helps companies and investors with the green transition?
Yes, the taxonomy is a guidance. It's a guidance to undertakings for assessing activities, defining corporate policies in view of enhancing environmental sustainability and reporting to stakeholders in a more comprehensive and comparable manner. It also helps them with planning their transition to much greater sustainability. But taxonomy is a guidance also for investors. For integrating sustainability themes in investment policy and understanding the environmental impact of the activities in which they might invest. And finally, taxonomy is also a guidance for the public institution to define and improve ecological transition policies and implement better partnership public-private schemes, which is one of the most important things now, especially when we talk about the next generation EU. Taxonomy enables to examine each operating line and production plant as part of investment analysis or the evaluation of a company's positioning versus competitors through KPIs such as turnover, CapEx, and OpEx. CapEx is particularly important as a dynamic and forward-looking indicators that refers to the strategic plans drawn up by companies aiming for a stepwise decarbonization within a specific time frame. Likewise, analysis of OpEx also is important and allow to keep track of the pursuing of intermediate targets of the ecological transition strategic plan. One important issue to stress is the problem of data. Data is quite important and enables investors to carry out an analysis of the alignment of companies to environmental objective. This should steer with heightening transparency and consciousness towards sustainable investment from towards low carbon or neutral carbon. In addition, in higher climate impact industries, this information enables to select the undertakings that are set on a course of ecological transition. Finally, investors can boost the effectiveness of their engagement actions by measuring their effect over time and strengthening their dialogue with the investee companies. Under the new strategy for sustainable finance of the European Commission, one of the main lines of action relates to strengthening the role of sustainable finance in supporting the transition. Indeed, the strategy mentions the introduction of minimum sustainability criteria for the financial product that promote ESG characteristics and shared labels for transition bond, sustainability-linked bond, and ESG benchmarks.
Thank you for that overview, Francesco. If you could elaborate on that further, what would the possible extensions of the EU taxonomy to social objectives and transition aspects, referring to significantly harmful activities or activities with no significant impact, what would that mean for companies and investors?
The efficacy of European transparency regulation depends on the availability of data, as I mentioned before. The data needs to be reliable and comparable. Undertakings must report according to common standard, and where data providers are involved, transparency on the calculation methodology used is necessary to prevent the risk of greenwashing, and we can say also social washing. Equally important, more undertakings should disclose information on sustainability themes, and the draft report of the platform go in this direction. If we talk about social economy would bring greater transparency for investors and the social impact and the performance of their investment. There is a vertical dimension useful for identify economic activities that make a substantial contribution to social objective. And there is also an horizontal dimension for some sector that may not be a universally acceptable answers to what should make a substantial contribution and or meet the DNSH criteria. It is crucial to be aligned with other EU corporate governance and supply chain due diligence initiatives, as well as EFRAG work on sustainability reporting standard and the SFDR-PI review. It's also important to define, as I say before, strict minimum standard social requirements, so complex process importance of commensurate and contextualize the social standard of the taxonomy with the peculiarities of the different territories and communities in order to address the actual demand for social investment, avoiding the standardization of inequalities in the different contexts. Furthermore, usability and divestment approach could bring to a list of socially harmful activities, could be detrimental to certain economic sectors, many of which are culturally and economic vital for natural and regional security. There is a need to evaluate the overall commitment to social issues and reorient sustainable capital flows to promote a better quality of life in terms of decent work and sustainable production model in every economic sectors. Regarding the extension of the environmental taxonomy, we think that significant harm taxonomy could contribute to greater transparency on the markets. An intermediate performance category would cover a broad set of activities with very different sustainability performance, potentially increasing the perceived greenwashing risk and making the taxonomy excessively complex. A no significant harm category is less relevant, and it could cover sector whose transition is not relevant for climate goals. So finally, potential problems related to usability is the risk of creating blacklists, including those activities that strongly require sustainability-oriented investments, practical use of an intermediate performance space to describe the dynamism of the transition of the real economy and the related greenwashing risks.
Really appreciate the detailed overview there, Francesco. For the benefit of our audience members who aren't lucky enough to be dealing with the EU taxonomy and sustainable finance regulations on a day-to-day basis, I just thought it would be worth kind of going through some of the acronyms that Francesco used. He mentioned DNSH, which stands for Do No Significant Harm. It's a criteria within the EU taxonomy which requires all activities to not harm any other environmental objectives. Francesco also mentioned the SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations, which is a set of measures aimed to prevent greenwash within the fund market. There's two sets of requirements. The first, which has come in earlier this year, requires asset managers to label their fund based on how stringently they integrate ESG considerations, and there'll be more detailed disclosure requirements that will be coming in next year. happy to answer any questions on this. If any of you are interested, you can contact me directly. Right, let's move on to Faith. Faith, what are the main policies required to support investors and contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation?
Thank you, Khalid. And I think it naturally stems from some of the sort of acronym debunking that you sort of did there. We talked about kind of those mandatory disclosures are being required both at a corporate and at sort of an investor level. I think those are quite critical. The toolkit that we've been talking about here around the EU Taxonomy, the Green Bond Standard, having these sort of consistent measures that we can then grip onto as investors, so we know that which are really there to assist with sort of stabilisation and avoidance of greenwashing. And sort of finally, real world policy. So to do with, like, we need ambitious NDCs, we need their near-term targets, we need to have policies of substance underneath those. We know those globally. We've called through things like our global investor statement for the cessation of fossil fuel subsidies. We need clear trajectories for transition plans for sort of technologies. Just to give a practical example of this, some of the declarations around internal combustion engines, it gives a very clear signal as to the direction of travel. That makes it much easier for investors, therefore, to put their money to work in terms of the solutions and alternatives. So we need that sort of clarity across kind of retrofit, real estate, carbon pricing. We know it's the elephant in the room, but we need carbon markets, we need price on carbon. These are critical components that will all help. Any one of these is all going to, any progress we can make in any of these all takes us forward. I think the key thing is also, as whilst we've got a lot of this toolkit for the EU, we need this globally. I think some of the commitments and work we're seeing in the link in, so we sort of see the cooperation between China and the EU in terms of the taxonomy, that is just essential. And we are global investors and we need these type of instruments across the globe.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that better policies and tools will help a wider group of investors kind of invest towards climate solutions. Do you mind drilling down into that a bit further?
Well, as I say, we need all investors, no matter where they're based, to all be doing this. So really, as I say, almost like kind of taking some of we're very privileged, and to have this EU context to working, because we're being equipped in a way that we say, but we want similar measures elsewhere, and to have those regional trajectories. These investments, I think it's helpful to have these clear plans in terms of regionally what are these technology rollout, what is the prioritisation, and how's those governments in those various places putting that. So that enables both those domestic investors to align their climate solutions, but it also allows me as an actual practitioner to also align and identify investment opportunities globally to put this money to work, because we know this is a global transition we need it to mobilise that across the globe. So I think more of that type of toolkit will be really helpful.
Let's bring it back to the practicalities of investing. Can you talk a bit about the experience of investors kind of applying the taxonomy to their portfolio and decision making?
So I'd say it's quite early days yet. I mean, as I say, I'm very supportive of the idea that we have these clear standards and we've got some clear definitions to work to. I think we need to sort of broaden that and see how we can apply it. I've certainly been interfacing with a lot of managers on how they're kind of pulling together that reporting, so they can tell me what they're doing on my behalf. We employ managers, we don't invest directly, but having that framework to identify investment opportunities. So the way we've used it at Brunel is that we're using the taxonomy as a framing for investment objectives. So we're setting kind of these a portion of some of these portfolios that we're looking to invest sort of going forward. These are themes that we will actively pursue because we know that we've got this framework underneath it. So some of these, particularly in private markets, are quite extensive. They go on for so we know that some of the reporting things will come through, but it's setting today some of that thinking, knowing that actually the reporting and the maturity of the use of this will come over time. But in the immediate term, set those as sort of use those that framing of taxonomy as a useful investment objective, as the themes that you could explore. That's certainly how we're using it, but I think it's still early days yet to using it.
Thank you very much, Faith. Faith mentioned something really interesting earlier about carbon pricing. I've not been paid to promote this, but I think it's really useful to read a report published yesterday jointly by PwC and the World Economic Forum, which looked at the potential impacts of a global carbon pricing scheme. Really interesting findings and some clear-cut recommendations for policymakers. And if I could plug my own publication, Responsible Investor, where I'm a reporter, carbon pricing has been a huge topic over the past few months, and investors are also looking into kind of investing in forest restoration schemes which generate carbon pricing as a form of generating investment returns, and also to support the scaling up of carbon markets. So really interesting topic there, really worth your time if that's the sort of thing you're interested in. All right, moving on to our last speaker for today, Marilyn. Marilyn, could you provide some examples of the EU initiatives supporting SMEs in the green transition?
Yes, I'm probably not in the position to tell you about all of the great things that the EU is doing, as it's really a lot. Of course, there's a lot of grant programs out there, but also different financial products. But I can tell you a bit more what the EIF will aim to do in the coming months and years. As mentioned earlier, we have a long-standing cooperation with the Commission, and we've been rolling out different financial instruments in the field of risk sharing with the private sector in order to bring in more private financial, private investors, private money into the sustainability space, but not only. All of the experiences that we have gained, we are now putting into practice, into rolling out those new programs under the InvestEU program that Ulla also mentioned earlier. We are one of the key partners of the Commission, not the only one, but jointly with the EIB, of course, we are already working on this. But also beyond, actually, we are also cooperating with member states, for example, under the Recovery and Resilience Facility. We hope to be able to do something meaningful also there. And very soon, actually, we are about to launch a sustainability guarantee product, for example, which will be both an uncapped and capped guarantee, portfolio guarantee for banks and guarantee institutions that will help these financial actors to take bigger risks when financing smaller businesses. Similarly, we will also be launching equity products and we'll be making cornerstone investments in venture capital and private equity funds that aim to target innovative companies from the earliest stages of development to later growth phases. Our focus will not only be on climate, but also on circular economy, agri-tech, nature-based solutions, for example. And as a new activity as of this year, we are also investing into infrastructure funds. So we've taken over this business line from the European Investment Bank. So we will be financing specialized sustainable infrastructure funds within the EU in key domains such as clean energy, sustainable transport, environment, resources. But as the Slido poll showed, actually, financing is of course not everything. And we are also thinking a lot about what we can do to enhance capacity building and some technical assistance tools to really build experience in the market and help both the financial sector but also the companies in this challenge. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Marilyn. If we could elaborate on that a bit, can you talk about how the EU taxonomy impacts SMEs?
Well, officially, for the time being at least, SMEs are so to say formally outside of the taxonomy regulation scope. But SMEs are they're not publicly disclosing, as Francesco also mentioned, those famous KPIs of the taxonomy, those the turnovers, capex, opex, and also the financial sector is not expected for the time being to include SME green finance in their own reporting and KPIs. But nevertheless, of course, we do believe that SMEs will be affected one way or another, for example, via being in the supply chain of larger corporates. And those corporates will need information for their own reporting obligations. But also, for example, when applying for public grants or also financial, let's say, loans, equity coming from EU budget, and for example, institutions such as EIF ourselves, we are launching the products. We are already integrating the EU Taxonomy in our green definitions where they are available, and there are more and more this kind of sustainability related criteria, of course, that is inspired by the taxonomy. And but we as well, similarly to the Commission, we don't want this to be to become a very burdensome exercise for the SMEs. So we're really thinking how to make this workable, both for our financial partners, because often there is really small scale financing and very small enterprises, and try to think about proportionality mechanisms and then also what is feasible. But it's true, and it's a fact that SMEs and mid-sized companies, they represent a key segment in the EU economy. So any transformational change in Europe, it just cannot take place without them. And while we of course recognize the urgency, of course, to support large energy intensive industries and projects, I think it's really key also to focus on the SMEs, and companies in any size can make a difference, either by changing the business model or bringing to the market new innovative services, technologies that help each of us in our everyday lives change a little bit what we're doing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Really stand behind some of those points, and I think EU regulation has also come around to acknowledging the important role that SMEs play in the economy. I think with the new disclosure regulations coming in under the CSRD, another acronym, my apologies, stands for Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That has been broadened to include smaller companies as well. So I think that's very much in line with the kind of broader EU approach to kind of companies economy-wide. I guess that wraps up our panel discussion for today. Audience members, today's your lucky day. Not only are we on time, we're ahead of time, so we should have around 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Hopefully the IT whizzes at the EU will flash up a screen which will list. Oh, there we've got our barrel overflows. Right, so let's get the show on the road. Let's start with a broader perspective. So we've got an audience member here who points out that Europe's green transition will not be enough to stop climate change. How can the EU at company and investor level ensure that other countries follow suit? I'm not sure if that's the most appropriate question for our panel, but let's see maybe. Marilyn, our representative from the EU, is this something you might be able to address?
Partly, EIF is really predominantly focusing on the European Union, so it's maybe a bit difficult, but of course we also cooperate with neighboring regions, with accession countries, and maybe one example that I could give you is that in our operations, in our due diligence, and our contractual requirements, we don't make a difference. We have the same rigorous procedure also outside the EU, and so thereby we are kind of sharing best practices, maybe leading by example, and also raising awareness. So this, at least from a financial sector point. But of course, on the company level, I would encourage maybe all larger corporates, especially, to look into their supply chain and then try to put into practice same kind of standards, approaches that they would implement when they would be operating in Europe, for example.
Faith.
Yeah, if I could add to that. So whilst the Paris-aligned investor initiative initially started with the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change as a sort of coalition of asset owners and asset managers, actually more broadly, it's been used now across globally with our sister organisations in both the US, Australia and APAC regions. So we are getting, and so those figures I was talking about in terms of the sort of commitments to net zero are global, and they're global investors. Most recently, the New Zealand Super Fund joined the Paris-aligned investor initiative. So again, the reach there is, and I think cooperating and sharing that best practice. And going forward, all of those organisations are actively involved in evolving the Paris-aligned investor initiative. Because even though we came up with that Net Zero Investor Framework Toolkit back in March, the first iteration of that, there are more asset classes to cover, and there are, we will evolve some of the thinking around kind of how do we deal with offsetting derivatives. So, there's sovereign debt, there's all sorts of things that we need to keep evolving the methodologies on as we go forward. And that sort of evolution now is very much a global effort, pulling together all of those sort of investor groups to support that net zero framework going forward. So I think we do need to lead and we need to support, but I think there's also a lot to learn and to bring in from those other nations as well.
Thank you very much, Faith. Appreciate both of you rowing in there. Next, there's a question here which seems to be quite interesting. I don't really understand what this acronym is, NBE. So the question is, what tools do European entrepreneurs have to start NBEs in Europe? Does that make sense to maybe Marilyn, if since entrepreneurship and SMEs are is in your wheelhouse? Does that make sense to you?
Unfortunately, that's not really an abbreviation I know.
Right. Okay. That's fine. I'm afraid we might need to skip that one, Cisco. There's also an interesting question here, not particularly relevant to this panel, about how much finance is dedicated towards European environmental NGOs. Basically, NGOs rely on grant funding, and a lot of NGOs kind of compete with each other for grant funding. It's very interesting kind of area, considering the outsized role they play on influencing policy and also investment activism. Maybe that's an area you might want to do some personal digging into. Right, how can the public sector encourage companies to make the investments necessary for the sustainable transition? We talked on quite a few of the tools available earlier, but maybe this Francesco might be able to speak to this.
Yes, this is quite important that we have an active role of public sector, but we have to think about the new kind of relationships. For example, in Italy, we experimented a dialogue among NGO and investors. Sometimes there are words that don't communicate one each other. And so it's quite important to approach to the problem with what I say at the beginning, a multi-stakeholder approach. I think that only with a system strategy, we can resolve the big problem and the global problems. In this sense, we have to align the objective of investors with the objective of the public policy. And I think that in this sense, the European Commission has a big role because it is the ideal framework to set up this kind of a collaboration.
Thank you, Francesco. We've got a question here on the German proposal for an international climate club. The proposal, if I could simplify it somewhat, refers to the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which allows the introduction of carbon pricing within Europe and protects the local industries within Europe from products from outside of Europe which don't have to pay a carbon tax. Faith, since you mentioned carbon pricing earlier, would you be able to speak to this?
Yeah, as delicately as possible. I have to say I haven't gone into the detail of that, but I think the idea of we do need to have, this is why we keep talking about a sort of a global market and efficient carbon markets working, so that we don't have arbitrage between those in terms of, we have a level playing field, so we genuinely deliver these objectives. So I think the principle, the objective that they're seeking to do there, I think I'm very supportive of. Although the devil is always in the details as to how to make sure that this happens in a very inclusive way. I think one of the other elements that we're also very aware of is the fact that we also need financial flows in the solutions to economies that are going to be more challenged by the transition and things like that. So how we kind of balance for those sort of conflicting areas, but I definitely support the broader objective is to ensure that we actually get those real world emissions, and by pricing that in and making sure that that becomes a level playing field, and people aren't disadvantaged from doing the right thing. Very supportive of that.
Fantastic, thank you very much. All right, we've got one here. May the extension of a green taxonomy and the creation of a social taxonomy be the decisive element to drive private capital to reach sustainability objectives? So connecting the dots with private investors. Francesco, you were talking about the social taxonomy earlier. Would you be able to address this particular viewer?
Yes, I mean that my consideration is, my comment on this is that first of all, we have to absolutely force a sort of integration between social taxonomy and environmental taxonomy. It's very dangerous that we consider the social aspects, the social issues, like out of the regulation of European Commission, even because social taxonomy could be very useful for investors, and we are sure that for a full sustainability approach, we have to continue to integrate social, environmental, and economic and financial aspect. So this is quite important for us. I think that we have to invest more in terms of even advocacy regarding the priority of this sector. Regarding the extension of environmental taxonomy, okay, this is what I said before. I mean that we have to pay attention to the usability. I mean that is not so easy in this moment to create a too rigid framework, and maybe could be useful, but in a second phase, I think that it is a good and strategic approach that we could like to follow.
Thank you, Francesco. We've got a question here which asks, how can investors identify and prioritize key investments to contribute to the Paris Agreement? I guess if I could jump in on this one, I guess that's what in part the EU taxonomy is aims to do. So at the moment there are two objectives which have been elaborated, which is mitigation and adaptation. There's 4 other objectives which will be set out in the future, but this gives the direction to investors on which areas need to be prioritized at this particular point in time. Is there anything that the panelists would like to add on that? Is there
perhaps if you allow me, Khalid, as we stressed, all of us, that basically taxonomy is a classification system. And as you correctly stressed, it should enable and it should attract the investors in. And if I can just provide you the timeline of the initiatives on taxonomy, basically the Commission will adopt a complementary climate delegated act in the near future. And also Commissioner McGuinness said last week that the objective is for this to be done by the end of this year still. And then furthermore, next year, the Commission will adopt another taxonomy delegated act covering the remaining 4 environmental objectives, as required also by the taxonomy regulation. And we will also adopt technical screening criteria for further activities contributing to climate objectives, such as, for example, manufacturing and transportation activities. We will also soon publish a report describing the provisions that would be required to cover economic activities that do not have a significant impact on environmental sustainability. This was basically required in July. But let me then also come to the question that I saw earlier on the taxonomy regulation, and these days very much outspoken nuclear energy. Last week, or no, the week before, on the 22nd of October, after the European Council, the European Commission President said at the press conference that the energy mix of the future needs more renewable and clean energy. And alongside this, we also need a stable source, nuclear energy, and during the transition, also natural gas. This is why, as called by many leaders at the Council, and also these days at the COP26, the Commission is going to come forward with a taxonomy proposal in the near future. And let me stress that the inclusion of the nuclear energy into the taxonomy framework has been really subject of an intense debate. And let me stress that while nuclear energy is consistently acknowledged as a low carbon energy source, opinions differ very much, notably on the potential impact on other environmental objectives, such as the environmental impact of the nuclear waste. And this is why the Commission wants to take any steps, if in this direction, based on science. And the Commission considers that the credibility of this assessment is really crucial. And it has recently requested the Joint Research Center, that's the Commission Scientific Service, to do and draft a technical report on the do no significant harm aspects of the nuclear energy. And this was already reviewed by the experts. If I'm not mistaken, the experts' reviews have been published on the Commission website. And this is why the Commission is carefully analyzing this science-based approach. And as I said, will come towards the end of this year with its decision related to taxonomy. So perhaps I was a bit broader, but just wanted to stress that how important is that there is a classification and that it's based on the science and proof and putting aside and the political debates. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ula. I appreciate you rowing in with quite candid remarks. Oh, Marilyn is unmuted. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just very quickly, because I see we're coming to an end. And I just wanted to say that, of course, the taxonomy is a very important classification tool that really gives a good indication. But maybe just to say that we shouldn't also be fixated on only those sectors and areas mentioned there, because we should really also try to, investors especially, I think it would be interesting to also support emerging technologies, innovation that is not, maybe it's faster paced and we can actually catch up in developing a common taxonomy with all the detailed technical criteria, and also the solutions that are actually behind all those technologies. ICT, because you need certain data platforms behind to actually operate your battery solutions and storages and your green mobility. So not to forget also about those. Thanks.
Many thanks, Marilyn. While we're talking about taxonomies, I think it would be remiss if I didn't mention that the EU's Common Ground Taxonomy, which puts together areas of commonality between the EU and China's green taxonomy, is now out for feedback. That's just fresh off the press earlier today. So definitely worth a look in if you're interested. I guess that leaves me to close up our session today. My thanks to all the speakers and to you, our audience, for joining us. Feel free to contact the speakers individually if there is anything you'd like to follow up from today's discussion. If you're interested to watch this session again, you'll be able to do so via the event link once this session has concluded. Thank you again from all of us. I would now like to invite Ula Hudina to deliver the closing remarks and to conclude today's session. Over to you, Ula.
Thank you very much, Khalid, and very warm thank you also to the other panelists, Faith, Marilyn, of course, Francesco, for having participated in this online panel, and of course to all the online participants for listening in. I started saying our discussion today that Europe is very ambitious in setting all these green targets and overhauling the relevant legislation and also enabling the EU funds and programs. But the objective of all these is to support the member states, economies, households in their green transition. And as I come from DG Grow, especially with focus on the SMEs, let me stress again that SMEs, and they're dealing with green transition, and the investments that we talked about today, they remain in our focus, and therefore we put so much effort on the InvestEU context and on this pragmatic approach that we have as regards the SMEs and the sustainability proofing. I hope this message will remain. Otherwise, what I believe that we stressed, and we heard today from the esteemed other panelists, that we need, in order to accelerate the green transition, and to meet all the objectives and to have all these sustainable investments, before all, we need clear targets. And we also need a collaborative approach, not just at the EU level, but also at the global level, which is then based on science, as we heard also from Merlin, it's based on ICT, it's based on innovation, technology, all this already exists. And what I think it's also important, it's based on the views from the practitioners, including on the socially acceptable investments, including on the do no significant harm investments. And this needs to be a collaborative approach. So let me conclude that let's turn all these challenges and huge investments needed there into opportunities when investing with sustainable finance. Thank you all for watching us.